Hey there, in this video we will look at basic multiplication. We'll start by looking at what multiplying means, how we can use different symbols to indicate multiplication, how we multiply by 0 and 1, and then also commutative and associative properties of multiplication. So with basic multiplication, for example, looking specifically at whole numbers that are positive or negative, we can think of it as repeated addition. So for example, 5 times 3 is equivalent to either 5 plus 5 plus 5, so 5 3 times, or 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3, so 3 5 times. So we can look at it either way. Either way, you end up with 15. When it comes to multiplying larger numbers, there are techniques that we will look at throughout the next couple videos to help you avoid mistakes and find the correct answer with that multiplication. So we have 4 different multiplication signs or ways of writing multiplication, and they differ really depending on if you're looking at textbooks or tests, websites, print versus online, all kinds of different formats, just depending on what you're looking at. So the first one we will look at is the X, which is your basic multiplication sign, and that's probably the first one that you learned when you were younger. The next one we'll look at is the middle dot. And so that's just a little dot, basically like a period, but up a little bit higher. So for example, looking at those two, we could write 2 times 3 with an X. We could also write it with that middle dot like this. The asterisk, this is commonly used in print or online formats. So that would be 2 and then the asterisk and then 3. Again, not usually used in written format, but typically in printed or online format. And then finally, no sign. So when we're looking at variables, which are just letters that represent different numbers, when we're looking at variables being multiplied, we typically will write our variables being multiplied without any signs in between them. So for example, AB really means A times B, but we usually write it like this without the multiplication symbol. Same thing here. 3CD, that means 3 times C times D, but we typically write it without when it comes to variables. And then here, A with the parentheses 2 plus B, this really means A times 2 plus B, but we usually don't write it with that asterisk or any of the multiplication symbols. So now we're going to look at multiplying by 0 and 1. So any number multiplied by 0 will always equal 0. There are no exceptions. So for example, A times 0 is 0. Additionally, any number multiplied by 1 is always going to equal itself. This is referred to as the identity property of multiplication. So for example, A times 1 is just going to be A. So for example, 4 times 0 is going to be 0 because anything times 0 is 0. And negative 8 times 1 is going to be negative 8. Whatever you multiply by 1 is just going to remain the same. Now, looking at the commutative and associative properties of multiplication, we have talked about the commutative and associative properties of addition. Now, this is looking at those same properties, but for multiplication. So they work just like our properties are commutative and associative properties of addition, and the fact that they really mean the same thing. It's just multiplication in between the numbers instead of addition. So the commutative property of multiplication states that you can reorder the terms in your expression in any order without affecting the value, as long as it is all multiplication. So for example, we see 9 times 568 times 1 times 2,234. I can write those 4 numbers in any order, and it means the same thing. It will get you the same result because of the commutative property of multiplication. So for example, I could reorder it as 1 times 98 times 568 times 2,234. I could also reorder it in a different way, like this. And then it says etc. because this could go on and on until you've written all possible orders. So that is the commutative property of multiplication. Now, additionally, the associative property of multiplication states that you can group the terms in any combination, therefore performing operations in different orders and still reaching the same correct result. So for example, we see parentheses down here. I do want to remind you that the parentheses indicate which operation to perform first. So for example, if we have this right here, 2 times 3 times 4 times 5, this would indicate we do 2 times 3 first. 2 times 3 is 6, and then we still have times 4 times 5. Then we would work left to right. 6 times 4 is 24. Times 5 is 120. So the correct answer is 120. Now, alternatively, we could rewrite this same thing. So this next part here is originally what we started with, but we could rewrite it a different way. So we could change the parentheses so that 3 times 4 comes first. And so we keep the 2 and we keep the 5 at the end, but do 3 times 4 first instead. You will get the same answer if you follow that. So 3 times 4 is 12. And then we have 2 times 12 times 5. I could put parentheses around here to indicate doing that first. 12 times 5 is 60. And then multiply by the 2. So there are a lot of ways that we can do this. That's just one alternative using the associative property of multiplication, which tells us we can do a different pair multiplied first and still get the same answer because it's all multiplication. Now, same thing here. We have 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 with 2 times 3 in parentheses. I could group 2 times 3 together and 4 times 5 together, and notice there's multiplication in between there. And if I do that, then what I will do is 2 times 3, which gives me 6, and then I will also do 4 times 5, which gives me 20, and then multiply those together. I will say that this alternative, that second alternative, is more commonly used in a beneficial way when you're trying to multiply multiple numbers together, because you can group together, for example, 2 numbers and 2 numbers, get 2 numbers out of that, and then multiply those together instead of having to do 2 and then multiply a third one in and then multiply a fourth one in, and however many there are. So that is a really beneficial use of the associative property of multiplication. Additionally, we can combine the commutative and associative properties to simplify an expression as well. So for example, if we're looking at that same expression, 2 times 3 times 4 times 5, I can not only change the grouping, but also the order of the numbers. So it doesn't have to go 2, 3, 4, 5. I could put 5, then 2, then 3, then 4, and also change the grouping so that 5 and 2 are together, and 3 and 4 are together. So in this case, 5 times 2 is 10, 3 times 4 is 12, multiply those together, and you get that 120. So again, this is another real life example of how you could benefit from knowing that the associative property and the commutative property work for the multiplication expressions. So this is a great way to do it simply because 5 times 2 and 3 times 4 are basic multiplication facts that you're more likely to know compared to, for example, this original where we had this 24 times 5. I'm not as likely to know 24 times 5 as I am 5 times 2 or 3 times 4. And then because 5 times 2 is 10, people are often a little more comfortable with multiplying by a 10 as opposed to multiplying 24 and 5. And we still get the same answer, but sometimes it's easier to do that mental math that way. So in summary, we looked at really 3 main topics: symbols. So when we're looking at symbols representing multiplication, we see not only the X, we also see the middle dot, we also see the asterisk, and then sometimes we see no sign, and that's really when we're looking at multiplication of variables. So for example, these 3 are examples where we typically write what's on the left side of the equal sign, but it means multiplication as indicated on the right side. Okay. And then our next topic that we looked at was multiplying by 0 and by 1. Remember, anytime we multiply by 0, we get 0. Anytime we multiply by 1, we get what we originally started with. So A times 1 is just going to be A. And then finally, the commutative property of multiplication allows us to change the order of the numbers, like we saw in this example here. And then the associative property of multiplication allows us to change the grouping of the numbers, to group them in a different fashion so that we multiply different pairs together first and then go from there.